Come now to motion number 4, relating to the UK's withdrawal from the European Union. I have provisionally selected the following amendments, colleagues, in the following order. A, in the name of the Leader of the Opposition, Jeremy Corbyn. And F, in the name of the Right Honourable Member for Normanton, Pontefract and Castleford, Yvette Cooper. I remind the House that reference may be made in debate to any of the amendments on the paper, including those which I have not selected. It is as on the order paper. Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support Amendment A in my name and the name of the Leader of the Opposition. It's 2 weeks since we last voted on a government Brexit motion, but nothing has changed. The government is no closer to making progress, and that's clear from the Prime Minister's statement yesterday and underlined by the absurdly limited motion that's before us today. The motion that the Prime Minister has put down is that this House notes her statement of yesterday and notes the discussions between the UK and the EU are ongoing. Mr. Speaker, the government doesn't even dare lay a motion reflecting the decisions of the 29th of January, as it did last time. It's frightened to lay a motion, even setting out what's already been agreed, namely the so-called Brady Amendment and the rejection already by this House of no deal as an acceptable outcome. So the statement of motion just seeks to buy another 2 weeks and note what's doing, all of this with just 30 days to go. One thing that's changed is the acceptance of the amendment by the member for South Leicestershire. And I do just want to ask some questions about that, because yesterday the Prime Minister appeared to rule out accepting that amendment. This morning, the Home Secretary was before the Home Affairs Select Committee, and he was questioned by the member for Cumbernauld, who said, "What's wrong with the amendment?" Home Secretary, "Nothing." So the government supporting it then? Answer, yes. What do you mean? When was the government not supporting it? When did you hear that? Question, yesterday. From whom? The Prime Minister. Did you? Well, Mr. Speaker, it does rather... It's a vignette on how Brexit's been going. But I think that the question that the House is struggling with is why the member for South Leicestershire has been forced to resign in the circumstances where the government is accepting his amendment. Mr. Speaker, last time we had this debate, I set out the sorry history of the government's delays in recent months, and I don't intend to repeat that. I will.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I am very grateful indeed to the Right Honourable Learned Gentleman for allowing me to make an intervention. I thought perhaps the Honourable Gentleman, the Right Honourable Gentleman, was going to also mention the other significant change, and that, of course, has been the Labour Party's policy towards a second referendum. The Right Honourable Gentleman will know very well that the Prime Minister warned in January of this year that the second referendum, and her words were, could damage social cohesion. Do the Labour Party believe that the Prime Minister was wrong on that? Yeah. Or is the Labour Party prepared to take that risk?
I'm grateful for that intervention. I will deal with it. I'm going to come to that. I'm going to deal with the background. I'm going to come to the amendment that we put forward, and I will come back to that. I will answer that intervention. If I don't, I'll take another intervention to make sure that I do. But just going back to the history, because there is, I'm afraid, it seems an expectation that between now and March the 12th, there's going to be a change to the deal. And I don't think that's going to happen. And I'll tell you why not. I'll tell you why not. Because there's been no progress at all since the vote was pulled on December the 10th. That's 79 days ago. 79 days. That was when the Prime Minister said, "I'm going to seek changes. I know what the House wants." 79 days. No progress has been made since the meaningful vote was lost on the 15th of January. That was 43 days ago. And no progress since the Brady Amendment of the 28th of January, 30 days ago. And so for all the talk of discussion here and in Brussels, the stark truth is this: not one word of the withdrawal agreement or the political declaration has changed since it was signed off on the 25th of November of last year. Not one word. That's 94 days, 3 months ago. The expectation that in the next 14 days all of that is going to change seems to me extremely unlikely and not going to be fulfilled. And I said when the Prime Minister went off to do this that she was building an expectation that she would not be able to fulfil. And I fear that's what we're heading for. The deal today is the same as it was 3 months ago, and it is that basic deal that will be put before us again on the 12th of March. It may have some warm words around it. The Attorney-General may be asked to say what those warm words mean, but the withdrawal agreement will be exactly the same in 2 weeks as it is now. And we have to face up to that. We have to face up to that and stop deluding ourselves that that is going to change in the next 14 days, because there are very serious consequences if that deal doesn't go through, because it's precisely the same, which is why there's been such questioning this morning about what happens next. The reason it hasn't changed is because the government has made 3 central demands. Firstly, a unilateral exit to the backstop. That has been roundly rejected every time it's been asked for, and the deal was signed off 94 days ago. They've asked, secondly, for a time limit to the backstop. That has been roundly rejected every time it's been asked for, and it was asked, and it was on the table 94 days ago. The only other area, or the only other ask, is that the backstop be replaced by alternative arrangements. The response of the EU to that, to the government, has been, well, what are you proposing? What are these alternatives so we can discuss them? And nothing has been forthcoming. We learned from the Prime Minister's statement today and from the Minister for the Cabinet Office at the dispatch box that there will be a joint work stream which will be considered by the EU and UK, and this may be an important strand. Now, I don't doubt that a joint work stream on alternative arrangements isn't a good idea. I don't doubt that any country would seek to streamline any checks at the border, whatever the arrangements, irrespective of Brexit. What I do know is that is a work stream that apparently is going to work through till the end of next year. The announcement that that work stream is in existence is hardly a breakthrough. It is hardly a breakthrough. The idea that the deal that was so roundly rejected is now going to go through because there's a work stream on alternative measures seems to me unlikely. And that's why we have got to get real about what's actually going to happen in 2 weeks' time. And that's why we do predict that we'll be left with exactly the same deal. And on the alternative arrangement, the Minister for the Cabinet Office says, well, it's words, those words are used elsewhere in the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration, and that's true. But they're only used in 2 respects, 2 different meanings. One is the alternative arrangements are the future relationship. That's one meaning attributed in those documents. Well, that's not relevant to this discussion, because if the future relationship is ready, there's no question of a backstop. We all know that. The only other way in which alternative arrangements are actually used in the documents, when you read the documents, is the technology at the border making all the difference. We've been searching for that for some time. I don't doubt there will be advances in technology. But the reason that the backstop was put in was because the assessment was, back in November, that there was no prospect of that technology being ready by the time the backstop would be needed, and therefore we needed the backstop. That was the conclusion. And I know, because, Mr Speaker, since I've been in this role, I seem to spend quite a lot of my time standing on borders, looking at lorries and people going across borders. I went to the Sweden-Norway border, the main border, to see what a border looks like where you've got a country which is in the EEA and therefore got single market alignment and free movement, but not in a customs union. It's a hard stop with infrastructure, with security, with paperwork, And when it works well, each stop takes 13 minutes. Now, those two countries are, those two countries are not operating the least efficient system that they can. They think they're operating the most efficient system they can. Now, I don't doubt it can be improved on, but I doubt that this work stream in the next few months, the end of next week, is going to make the progress that many people in this House think is going to happen. I will give way.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. He has just now referred to spending a lot of his time standing at borders. When he was at the border in Northern Ireland, was he able to see and grasp the complete and total complexity of that border, the hundreds of crossing points that there are, and the total impossibility of anyone, anywhere, constructing a hard border that couldn't be avoided with ease?
I was, and I have. I visited that border many, many times. I visited with the Police Service of Northern Ireland many times when I was working there for 5 years as they policed the area around the border, which has particular issues. And I've been there since on a number of occasions. And I'm well aware of the nature of that border. I'm also well aware of the fact that in relation to that border, it's a mistake to think that the only issue is technically how you get people or goods over a line in the road. That border is the manifestation of peace. It is a settlement between two communities, and therefore the very idea that this is just a technical exercise doesn't understand the nature of that border. I will just press on, then I will give way. I'll give way, and then I think I've heard one over.
I'm most grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. It goes beyond that, doesn't it? And he may share my anxiety that this issue seems to be consistently ducked. We have a pre-existing international treaty with Ireland which places obligations on us in respect of the border. And I do worry, and he may share this anxiety, that in this House this is constantly brushed under the carpet, whereas as we are a rule of law state that believes in the international rules-based system, we cannot depart from that without reneging on that obligation.
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention, and I agree with it. Mr. Speaker, when the Prime... And this is really the heart of it. We know what the problem is. We know what the House thinks about the backstop. We know that there's an unlikelihood that those problems are going to be addressed in the next 14 days. So when the Prime Minister lost the first meaningful vote, she had a clear choice. Choice one, plough on with the failed deal in the usual blinkered way and eventually put the same deal back to us. That was option one. Or option two, drop her red lines, negotiate changes that are credible with the EU and could command a majority in this House. The government has chosen the first course, blindly ploughing on rather than really engaging. And as we've seen from the last few weeks, that path leads nowhere. Now, that is regrettable because there's an alternative, and I want to address Amendment A. We've set out this alternative repeatedly over recent months, and it was set out in full in the letter from the Leader of the Opposition to the Prime Minister on the 6th of February, and it's spelt out in today's Amendment A. I remind the House that the focus of the changes we're calling for are to the political declaration, not the backstop, and they are to negotiate a permanent and comprehensive UK-wide customs union. That's the first part. Why is that important? Because it's essential to protecting manufacturing and particularly the complex supply chains, and to avoid the hard border in Northern Ireland. And I know that those on the front bench and opposite, like myself, have gone to many of the big manufacturing companies to discuss with them their complex supply chains and how anxious they are about protecting the customs union arrangement that allow them to do that. It's essential also, as I say, to avoid a hard border in Northern Ireland. Now, I'll just make this point and then I will give way. The Prime Minister has pretended that her customs proposals achieve that, and I listened very carefully to what the Minister from the Cabinet Office said just now about Amendment A on this, because he has said under the political declaration the benefits are already there. The political declaration notes the single customs territory in the Northern Ireland backstop obviates the need for rules of origin. So the political declaration notes the backstop, which is the contentious bit of the withdrawal agreement. So it notes it. Now, that is a form of customs union. I concede that. In the backstop, that single customs territory does obviate the need for rules of origins check. The declaration goes on, and this goes to the heart of what the Minister for the Cabinet Office just said. It says, if we build and improve on that customs union for the future partnership, we can continue to avoid customs checks. Well, let's just unpick that. If we build on the backstop, which is the bit that, as I understand it, many members opposite don't like, we can get to the position of avoiding customs checks. If we build. So the temporary backstop, so contentious, never to be used, only an insurance policy, hope never to do it, has to become permanent, turbocharged, and the foundation stone of the political declaration in order to get the protection of a customs union. That is precisely what the political declaration says. And I'm not sure that the Minister of the Cabinet Office has explained that to all of the members behind him, because if the proposition is that the backstop is not just a short-term temporary measure, it's actually the essential foundation of the political relationship, I think it might be met with a particular response. And of course, I will in just one second. The pretence that the political declaration equals the same as a customs union, it goes against the stated aim of the government to be outside a customs union. I will give way.
I listened with care to the Chancellor of Duchy's response to the 5 principles at the end of his speech. Did it seem to the right honourable gentleman that the Chancellor of the Duchy did not disagree with any of the 5 principles? Rather, I don't disagree with any of them. And he tried most of the time to demonstrate their compatibility with the political agreement. He might have hesitated because in the Chequers policy, the government went beyond this. It was proposing a single market in goods for about 48 hours at that stage. So, although this is only, he raised negotiating points about what about new trade agreements with other countries? What would it mean for freedom of movement? But all that's covered in the negotiations eventually. Wouldn't it help if the 2 front benches could agree on these 5 principles? It might transform the atmosphere of this debate when we move on to the next stage of the negotiations after the withdrawal agreement.
I'm grateful for that intervention, and as has already been alluded to, I am having discussions with the opposition front bench, including the Minister for the Cabinet Office. I don't intend to disclose what's been said in confidence in those discussions, and they will continue, and we will play our part in them. And I know that we're trying to set up the next meeting, and we'll do that as soon as possible. I just need to address this point. But the point. I just want to finish answering this question. The point is this: that unless and until there's a change of the Prime Minister's red lines, it's impossible to find any space for those negotiations to progress. And so far, I don't rule out something dramatic next week. Maybe the Prime Minister coming to the dispatch box and saying, I've now understood that my red lines were the problem and I'm prepared to change them. But I don't think it's going to happen. I have concluded that the Prime Minister is going to plough on with the deal that she put before us last time, and that she's not willing to drop her red lines that would allow a more fruitful progress in those discussions. I say that without prejudice to the fact that those discussions will go on between now and the 12th of March, but the fact that there's a date already for the deal to come back already set in 2 weeks' time makes me just a little cautious in suggesting that that's going to bear fruit in those next 2 weeks. I will give way, and then we'll...
Very grateful for the honourable gentleman for giving way. As he knows, I shall be voting for the Prime Minister's deal, and actually I think something has changed that he didn't admit at the beginning of his speech, which is the circumstance of the last 24 hours, which I think may change minds on these benches quite significantly and favourably. But if it doesn't pass, while I completely agree with him that under those circumstances the government will need to look again at its red lines in order to try to get an agreement, which is somewhere in the region of what the honourable gentleman has been describing, will he also commit from his benches that the Labour frontbench will exercise flexibility. So, because actually my whole experience of dealing with coalition government was it takes two to tango. You have to have flexibility on both sides to get to an agreement.
I'm grateful for that intervention, and we are playing our part in those discussions with the government and will continue to do so for as long as is necessary. I don't want to go into what we're discussing, but we will continue to do so as long as is necessary. I'm just slightly cautious as to the likelihood that that's going to lead to a breakthrough in the next 14 days.
I must say that the honourable gentleman is possibly generating more alarm than he realises. The idea that there is going to be some compromise between the two sides of the House on this question does, in relation to the red lines, does actually raise a very simple question, and it's this. Would the honourable gentleman like to state on behalf of the opposition that they would like to see the repeal of the European Community Act 972?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful for that intervention. Because what it demonstrates is the point I was trying to make about the customs union, which is if the government from bench say our political declaration is in effect a customs union by a different name, because we're going to build on the backstop and make it permanent and turbocharge it, I suspect there's going to be a degree of opposition to that, if I've understood anything about debates that have been going on here for some considerable time. And that's where the difference is. As for the repeal of the 72 Act, I have always said, and stand by it, that repealing that Act and putting a date for leaving in the Withdrawal Act was a mistake, and I've always, because of the transition period. And I've always said that the Act we've passed will have to be repealed before it comes into force, and so it will. The implementation bill, the White Paper, specifically says it's going to, as the honourable member well knows. In other words, between now and the end of March, we have got to intercept that Withdrawal Act we've passed if there's going to be any order to leaving the EU, and ensure that things like the ceasing of the jurisdiction of the European Court is changed. It was balmy to turn the European Court off on at 11 o'clock on the 29th of March. That's the current law, because you can't get on to transition. And I always said that before that comes into force, if this is going to make any sense at all, it's going to have to be changed, intercepted and repealed. And that is exactly what the implementation bill will do. I am as sure as I could possibly can be. I'm going to press on because I'm just going to make some progress. I will give way in just a minute, but I am conscious, Mr. Speaker, and I don't criticise the Minister for the Cabinet Office, because I think he quite rightly took interventions from people, from a number of members, that they really did want detailed answers too. But I am going to try and make some progress, because otherwise, between the two of us, we really are going to get to the wind-ups before we've got anywhere else. So let me move on to closer alignment with the single market. This part of the Brexit debate is too often ignored. I.e., how do we protect our service sector, which, of course, is 80% of our economy and 80% of our jobs? And it's the second part of this package that's also needed alongside a customs union in order to prevent a hard border in Northern Ireland. And we recognise that if you're going to have closer alignment with the single market, you do need that underpinned by shared institutions, and it would require accepting common obligations. What they are would be a matter of negotiation, and how we stay aligned would be part of the negotiations. And I'm not pretending that will be trouble-free. But we do need to, again, the Minister for the Cabinet Office said, well, that's effectively there in the political declaration, as close as you can get. Well, it's worth going back to the political declaration that the Prime Minister has put before us, because what it actually says is that we should achieve, quotes, a level of liberalisation in trade and services well beyond the parties' WTO commitments. Well, you can't aim much lower than that. That is, to quote the former UK Permanent Representative, about as unambitious as it can get. The third part of the amendment for the House is dynamic alignment of rights and protections. That means UK standards keeping pace with evolving standards across Europe. Why is that needed? Because we can't allow UK workers or consumers to see their rights lag behind those in the EU after we leave, or, frankly, to allow future governments to erode those rights. Now, again, the Minister for the Cabinet Office says, well, that's effectively there in the political declaration or been promised by the Prime Minister. There is a world of difference between keeping up with evolving rights and a non-regression clause that simply says they won't drop behind the frozen level of those. And so the answer from the government simply isn't strong enough. They are only promising non-regression, to freeze, not to keep pace. That is a world of difference. And it's no wonder the trade unions were never going to sign up to that appeal. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister yesterday said, well, don't worry. What we'll do is every time there's an evolution of rights in Europe, we'll come back here and see whether this House wants to keep up. But she didn't say, my government will vote to do so. That would make a material difference, but she didn't. And so neither we nor working people are going to fall for that one. The fourth and fifth elements are clear commitments on participation in EU agencies and funding programmes, and unambiguous agreements on the detail of future security arrangements, including access to the European arrest warrant arrangement. And I don't doubt the Prime Minister's commitment on this. I did work with her when she was Home Secretary, and I know how seriously she takes this. But I also know that in the political declaration it does not say that there's been any progress towards a replica arrangements for the European arrest warrants. And I do know because with the Prime Minister back in, I think, 2012 or 13, we looked at what would happen if we fell out of the European arrest warrant arrangements and what the old extradition treaties were. And we were horrified by what we saw. Outside the European arrest warrant, it takes about 10 years to extradite someone from countries such as Italy to this country. And there are real live examples of that. Using the European arrest warrant, it takes about 40 or 50 days. Material differences, and there's nothing in the political declaration along those lines. And I do understand the technical problems with Schengen, etc., but one of the barriers here has been the determination that the European Court should have no role in anything at all in the future, and thus blocking progress in this area. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm not pretending that the plan, the alternative we've set out, is easy or painless to negotiate. I've never pretended that will be the easiest negotiation in history. But I do know this, that kind of deal, delivering a close economic relationship with the EU, would prevent a hard border in Northern Ireland and reduce the pressure on the backstop and could be negotiated. The EU has said as much in recent weeks. We've heard it in meetings with EU counterparts and in public that the Customs Union single market alignment proposition is a credible proposition. The EU have said it's a promising basis for negotiations. And to quote Michel Barnier, if the United Kingdom chooses to let its red lines change, then the European Union will be ready immediately to respond favourably. I think it could be achieved. If the Prime Minister is serious about reaching out to the opposition, she should engage in that proposal. It's clear from her response to the Leader of the Opposition and her blind insistence on seeking further change to the backstop that that is not her intention. So today we put that plan to the House and ask for Parliament to help in delivering the basis for a credible Brexit offer. I will give way.
I'm grateful to him for giving way. I mean, I've been listening with some interest to his explanation of the 5 bullet points that are so important in the Leader of the Opposition's amendment. But most of these are fundamentally to do with the future phase of negotiations. They're not specifically to do with the Withdrawal Agreement bill, and therefore I'm still puzzled as to what the major difference between his party is and why they can't agree with the government to secure a Withdrawal Agreement and get that through Parliament.
I think I had said earlier that and acknowledged that these points go predominantly to the political declaration and not to the withdrawal agreement. Those two documents cannot be separated because they go together. Well, the example of that is the Customs Union. On the government, what the political declaration says is that it builds on the withdrawal agreement. You can't treat them as two separate documents. And the legislation that we're voting on doesn't allow us to vote on them separately. But as for the general proposition that do we accept that, for example, the backstop, whatever concerns we have about it is inevitable, then yes. And I said that when I stood here 2 weeks ago, and I make that clear again today. I will briefly.
Or to the honourable gentleman for giving way. But the Leader of the Opposition has said he objects to the backstop because it won't be just permanent, it's potentially forever. Does he have any qualms about that at all, or not? Because otherwise, he should be supporting the withdrawal agreements, since most of this, particularly A(i), is contained within the backstop.
Again, I tried to deal with this last time I was at the dispatch box, but I'll have another go. We do have concerns about the backstop. There are concerns about the exit arrangements. There are concerns that England, Wales and Scotland, on the face of it, fall out of single market alignment when you're on the backstop. There are concerns that the protection of workplace rights, environmental rights, etc., non-regression protections, etc., and the enforcement mechanism isn't the same as it is for other provisions, such as procurement. So there are real deep concerns. But, notwithstanding those concerns, we accept, because of our commitment to the Good Friday Agreement, that at this stage, 2 years in, with 30 days to go, that a backstop is inevitable. And I hope that makes that clear. But I do not think that you can just separate out the two documents and treat them as separate documents to be voted on separately. And the legislation doesn't allow us to do that. The legislation requires both documents to go through in order to move forward. I will give way.
To the Vice Honourable Gentleman give way. But given that Labour Party policy a week ago on a second referendum was different to what it is today, can I encourage him to be more optimistic? And that is, the Prime Minister could indeed get changes to the backstop, timetable limit, get out clause later on. If she does make those changes, if she is successful, given what he's just said, will he then support the government in order that we avoid no deal?
I understand the point and the force with which it's put. I have to say, given the conversations that have gone on here and in Brussels, that I really don't see the prospect that after 94 days of trying, there's going to now be a breakthrough in the next 7 days. Now, if there is, we must all come back. There will be a statement from the Prime Minister and we'll consider what she says. It will only be on the backstop. Now, we've accepted the inevitability of the backstop, so it's to try and, that is more to try and solve a problem on our own benches than with the opposition. But we will wait. I've always said that we will always look at what the Prime Minister brings back. It's what we did when she brought back the deal in the first place. People invited me to commit beforehand that we would do this or do that and the other. I said I'd wait to see what it is. I will faithfully wait to see. But I don't think, at the moment, I personally don't think that we're going to be standing here in 2 weeks with significant changes or any changes to the withdrawal agreement. I will wait and I will see. I know members opposite want to be optimistic. My worry is that there is still this expectation of changes which isn't going to happen, and therefore a lack of focus on what needs to happen next. And it is why what the Prime Minister said yesterday was significant, because if the deal doesn't go through, then obviously what happens next becomes deeply significant. But I will, in full answer, and we will faithfully look at whatever comes back and consider it. Mr Speaker, so that is a credible plan. That is a plan that's capable of negotiation, and it's one that the EU are prepared to negotiate. The only question now is the Prime Minister prepared to drop her red line so that there can be a meaningful engagement with that alternative proposition? I do invite members to vote for our amendment tonight to ensure that that plan can form a consensus or a majority in this House to take us through to the next stage of the process. Mr Speaker, I do want to underline the commitment we made on Monday that if this amendment, Amendment A, is defeated and the Prime Minister refuses to negotiate a close economic relationship, Labour will support or put forward an amendment in favour of a public vote. That public vote would include an incredible leave option and remain. It could be attached to the Prime Minister's deal, what I've called a lock against a damaging Tory Brexit, or it could be attached to any deal that managed to win a majority in the House of Commons. I will deal with the intervention that was put. It was put to me earlier that this is a course we should not adopt because of the social unrest it might cause. There are a number of answers to that I need to put. The first is this comes at the stage where we're trying to prevent no deal. And I do not think that no deal is going to be orderly and smooth. I think it's going to lead to huge problems up and down the country. So it needs to be seen as to what it's up against. Secondly, I don't think, or I think it's important that we do not exaggerate social disorder. because that can encourage social disorder. And I'm really worried about that. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that the Honourable Lady, I'm really not. I take very seriously our interventions, as she knows, but I don't think we should casually say, well, there'll be social disorder. And the third thing I'd say is this. I've only been in this place less than 4 years, but the idea that we wouldn't take the right next step as a matter of principle because we thought there might be social disorder is a very, very slippery slope. I'll give way to the learned member.
Him for giving way. Does he not also agree with me that a parliament that just simply guessed what version of Brexit or outcome people wanted, did it and then hoped it was the right one for the British people, that fundamentally would not be a pragmatic, sensible, sustainable or democratically acceptable way of proceeding?
I'm grateful for that intervention for two reasons. Firstly, I have been very hard on the Prime Minister, and I think justifiably, for the fact that she's set out those red lines without any discussion in Parliament, or even, as I understand it, in the Cabinet, about those red lines. It was her almost personal interpretation of the referendum. In my view, there were many interpretations that could have been put on it, and it wasn't that one. But the second point is important because I am concerned as to whether getting a deal that isn't really liked through at the last minute is going to settle anything. Is really going to close. There's not going to be closure if there's a night in March, when in a sweaty night in March something goes through that nobody really likes. The idea that that's closure is really worrying. And of course, we're building up the expectation that if a deal goes through, that's it, Brexit's settled, it's all over. We're still in the foothills because all that's then going to happen is the negotiations on the future relationship, which is going to be... It's so thin at the moment. It's the whole thing which is going to have to give... I will give way. I was going to give way behind me first.
Well, on the point of social order, as someone who has faced social disorder in my own constituency and rightly condemned it, however hard it was for some constituents to hear, does he agree with me that some in our country on the hard right who are suggesting social disorder forget that this is the country that faced down Mosley at home, faced down Hitler and Mussolini abroad? We can never give in to hard right pressure.
I agree wholeheartedly with the honourable member for that. I think there was an intervention here that I wanted to take.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and actually, if I could agree with my honourable from Tottenham, Stoke-on-Trent was a city described as the jewel in the crown by the BNP, and we took no prisoners in fighting them on the streets to rid them, so there will be no argument for me against that. But the honourable gentleman said that there could be a public vote on a deal versus remain at some point in the future. Could the honourable gentleman outline for me, so I'm clear in terms of our party's policy, what is the nature of the deal that he would like to see on a ballot paper that would convince him to vote for that deal rather than vote for Remain? Because it appears to me that at the moment the Labour Party policy is actually to revoke Article 50 at pretty much any cost.
At the moment, of course, it's important to appreciate that I am pressing an amendment that is in favour of a Brexit deal. It is what we... In our manifesto, we said if elected, we would seek to negotiate. We would end Theresa May's reckless approach to Brexit. We would scrap the Conservatives' Brexit white paper and replace it with fresh negotiating priorities, with a strong emphasis on retaining the benefits of the single market and the customs union. And we set out why that was necessary. We also said that we recognise that leaving the EU with no deal is the worst possible deal for Britain, and that we reject no deal as a viable option. Well, I haven't finished answering the question yet. So what I am putting before the House today is entirely consistent with what we said in our manifesto we would seek to do. Therefore, the question will be whether we can carry that tonight. If I haven't finished the answer, and it's an important question, if that can't be done, we are faced in 2 weeks with what I think will be the Prime Minister's red line deal or no deal. In our manifesto, we rejected both. We rejected both. And in those circumstances, we would either put forward or support a motion on a public vote with a credible leave option. When we put a frontbench amendment 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, we said we spelt out that would have to be a deal or proposition that had the confidence of the House, and the other option would be remain. I did say I would give way here.
I'm very grateful to the honourable and learned gentleman for giving way, and I welcome movement of the Labour Party towards a second referendum. Some people say that a second Brexit referendum would be undemocratic, but does the honourable and learned gentleman agree with Martin Wolf, writing in the Financial Times today, who said, if democracy means anything, it's a country's right to change its mind?
Yes, I think that was also repeated by the first Brexit Secretary on a number of occasions, although I'm never quite sure whether I should quote the first Brexit Secretary or the second. But, of course, I listen carefully to the third every time and look forward to seeing him yet again tomorrow morning at the dispatch box. Now, I'm going to make some progress, Mr Speaker, because I've now been on my feet for 40 minutes. So we are putting forward a credible plan. We are making it clear that if that is not carried and we're left with the option of Theresa May's deal on her red lines or no deal, then we will put down ourselves or support a motion in favour of a public vote in order to prevent a damaging Tory Brexit. Now, Mr Speaker, I have got a section in my speech on extending Article 50 and the amendment that has been put down by others. I hear what they say about that, and I commend their efforts to push the government on this and to get the commitments we got yesterday and again from the dispatch box today. It would not have happened without the concerted effort on these benches, along with others across the House, to get that. It is extremely important that we now know that should the deal not go through on the 12th of March, there will be a binding vote on no deal. We've already had one, and more than one, indicating where the will of the House is. And if that doesn't happen, there will be binding vote on extending Article 50. And in those circumstances, Mr Speaker, I urge all members to follow our amendment. Thank you.